Hi and welcome to the XMPro future of BPM. I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me, so if you can maybe just confirm that you can hear me. Thanks very much. Great. Work is changing faster than ever, and the way that we work is also changing faster than ever. We're more interrupt driven, we have more information, or should I say data, than ever, and the world around us has become a lot more unpredictable than ever. I'm Pieter van Schalkwyk, I'm the MD of XMPro, and I'd like to thank you for joining me when we have a look at how we move from business process management to what Gartner is now calling intelligent business operations, and why we have to do this and what the benefits is of that. Just making sure I'm on the right screen here. So if we look at the drivers of this change, one of the aspects I'd like to cover today, and then also what just some three elements of this intelligent business operations, or IBO. So I'll just be calling it IBO, intelligent business operations. Another new three-letter acronym that we have. And lastly, we'll also just have a look of an example of what it could like, or what IBO could look like and does look like inside XMPro. So why are we now talking about intelligent business operations? What are the drivers for that? Well, businesses and the organizations that support them are now more than ever a lot more complex, a lot more chaotic, and a lot more unpredictable. At the recent Gartner IT Expo, where we were, this CIO Summit, the keynote cited that the following disruptive technologies are changing the landscape for businesses, and specifically CIOs and CEOs, CFOs. And those drivers are essentially cloud. Cloud adoption is a lot faster than what most people anticipated, and that brings about a whole new change of how we work. Social in the enterprise is there. It has found its way in, and we actually have a separate webinar that you may have seen around social listening, how we handle social listening. So social and social media is now has found its way into the enterprise, and it's not going to go away. So it's also changing the way that people behave and that they expect the tools that support them also change. The other interesting thing is that mobile search is set to overtake desktop search in the next 2 years. We had a conversation recently with a CIO that said their whole IT strategy has changed overnight when a CEO walked in with his iPad into a board meeting. So those drivers, combined with the fact that we have all these systems that now drive data, those three components plus the big data that a lot of this generate, are the key drivers, or the key disruptive drivers, according to Gartner, why this is all happening. The challenge that we have is how to make this work inside our businesses and organizations. So I actually have a great, once again I'm going to refer to Gartner for this, and it actually comes out of Janelle Hill's presentation around operational resilience and where BPM is going. And she's saying that newer technologies, including social media, context-aware technologies, cloud, and all these things that I've just mentioned, the intelligent phones and devices, can revolutionize the way we work together. The challenge is enterprises have not yet empowered frontline employees to dynamically adjust the way they work in response to these contextual opportunities of threats. And I'll explain more of this as we go. The other thing that we find is that the software that we use at the moment cannot be applied to this knowledge-centric work style, and decision-making, risk assessment, pattern seeking and matching, group collaboration. Most of these are supported at the moment with point solutions. So you have a specific application for pattern seeking, something for decision making, something for risk assessment. But all of these, the way that we work, all of these are converging into a single environment. The biggest challenge is that as leading economies are increasingly dependent on service-based industries, a lot of that turns into the fact that they're heavily dependent on knowledge work, on knowledge workers and managers that understand that, and they're all overwhelmed with data and choices. Now that is from Janelle Hill at Gartner. How do we turn that into how does that relate to what we know? So what does that mean for BPM, and how did we go from workflow, which is factory style or automation of work, just trying to get it done faster, to something like BPM, with business process management, which is knowledge style, where we're trying to have more control of process. If you look at what the definition of process management, it's all around control and having a lot more management capability rather than just automation, so that we have some idea of where it's going. Intelligent business operation, to me, so when we start off with workflow, it's factory style, BPM, it's knowledge style. Intelligent business operation is all around a goal-driven style, where we're actually trying to support business outcomes or business objectives. So it's not just around process control and having audit trials and having decision trials, but it's also extending it to how can we better support the outcomes of business. The best way of looking at this is just to looking at how the definition has changed. What Gartner said a couple of years ago, we had a slide that says BPM is IT-enabled management discipline. Quite simple. They've now changed the definition, looking at this operational excellence, where there's an expectation for BPM to support not just the automation or IT enablement of managing processes, but there's actually a bigger expectation around BPM, and that's moving us towards intelligent business operation. So according to them, BPM is a management discipline that treats processes as assets. A key part, you need a repository of processes that you can access, and you can treat those as assets inside the business. They need to contribute directly to enterprise performance. So a key element of that which I like is the fact that there's a clear line of sight for metrics and outcomes. So you need to understand how this process that you have as a process asset, how that contributes to what your operational excellence is, which is the next step here, by driving operational excellence and agility. I did a webinar not too long ago where I was talking about these things that we do as supporting operational KPIs. At the end of the day, the operational KPIs are what determines the success of a business. So looking at BPM going forward, it needs to be a lot more around visibility, accountability, and it also needs to change as processes need to change. Once again, I just want to highlight some of the facts, some of the points that they've made here around the attributes, things like a clear line of sight for metrics and outcomes, and ability, you must be able to change it, and the fact that the business models that you construct are not just around the flow, but it needs to also show it to all process participants. So that when you drive a process from an intelligent business point of view, that you actually know what the process is going to do and you understand the options. So if we look at intelligent business operations itself, the reason why it's moving from BPM to IBO is the fact that we want to support this contextual knowledge work. What we mean by that is people now have information around activities that they do. It's not just factory style where I just accept what comes from someone else and I just do my little part of my activity or process and pass it on. That is a factory style where it's almost like machines in a sequence. The way that we work now is we get information from various sources, and as we take that contextual knowledge, our processes need to support that. Processes are not that sequential anymore. Processes, in actual fact, they can come from anywhere and they can go anywhere. We need to have better support for decision making. It's a key part of intelligent business operations. How do we make better decisions now that we've got all this big data coming at us? We've got more dashboard tools than ever. We've got more metrics than ever. How do we apply that so that we can make better decisions? We don't work in isolation. So another objective of intelligent business operations, or IBO, is the fact that we need to take all these conversations that we're having, all the emails that we send around, which are currently not part of our processes or workflows or BPMs, and bake that into our processes so that we can incorporate some of the social rules that come out of that. And essentially all it is, it's all around getting better at getting work done, which is what XMPro is all about. So if we look at BPM going forward, what does IBO really look like? Well, in the first place, it needs to have support for unstructured processes. And also, there's a previous webinar where we discussed unstructured processes to some degree, but it really means that there's no predefined flow. So there's a number of activities or possibilities that we can do, and we can add to that. So if we discover new requirements that we have, we can add those. What we mean by unstructured process is you don't necessarily have to draw the flow diagram, and I'll get into a little bit more detail around that. It also needs to have support for what we call dynamic processes. Now, unstructured doesn't mean uncontrolled, and dynamic processes are different to unstructured processes. A dynamic process is where it can change based on external events or external influences, or maybe in some instances internal rules that may dictate, and we'll look at some of the examples of what a dynamic process is. So for an intelligent business process, it needs to be able to be agile, it needs to be unstructured and flexible, it needs to be able to adapt itself by being a dynamic, and also it needs to incorporate the social aspects of the way that we interact in work. We don't work in isolation, and there's a lot of conversation that goes around our activities and processes, and all of that combined gives us intelligent business operations. There are a few more elements to it, but these are the three main key things. If you look at why we're looking at intelligent business operations, or what does it mean for you, it means that we can cater for a broader range of work. It's a lot more intelligent in terms of how it can adapt, and we also incorporate conversations from outside. So if we look at those three elements in a bit more detail, so if I look at unstructured, dynamic, and social, if we look at unstructured to start off with, now this is a typical unstructured process, and this is an XMPro designer, and this is just a very simple example. But for example, if there's an opportunity management where we're going to capture opportunities, we may decide to have bid committees, we can create quotes, we can send it for technical adjudication, there's credit checks, and all sorts of things that can be done. You don't have to draw the flow diagram, because this can happen in any sequence. This we refer to as a process container. So there's a container, and I can add new process elements to this in order to cater for my requirements. So as you can see, there's no predefined flow set up. You can include some rules to make sure that there are certain flows that are enforced in certain conditions, and that is an aspect which is driven by the dynamic side. So even a controlled process is a specific case of a dynamic process where certain rules are applied. So unstructured process means, from an intelligent business operations point of view, it means we've moved on from workflow, where we have workflow-based tools that have a predefined routing. Because of my contextual knowledge, I know that I may want to send it to a bid committee. In certain instances, it will force me to send it to a bid committee, and I'll touch on some of those rules. The benefits of this is it's actually less costly and more adaptive to build this. So as soon as you discover new requirements, it's quite easy to adapt. You don't have to get, it's not, so when you've got a pre-built and a complex workflow set up, in order to change it is actually quite costly. With this, approach that we have around unstructured processes is actually quite easy. We can drag another or drop another activity into the process container and very quickly expose that to the business users at a very low cost. The other thing is you spend less time designing and more time doing. We find there's a big resistance in trying to get to the 100% process. People don't get to that point. You can spend a lot of time what we call analysis paralysis. So you can spend a lot of time trying to get the 100% model, and by the time that you actually get to run it and automate it, that it's actually out of date. So with this approach, the benefit is that you can spend less time designing and more time doing. So it's a lot more of an agile approach. We'll take what we have and we can start. We don't have to wait to get the perfect process, because we will never get there. And it also takes away that fear of analysis paralysis. We can experiment. It gives us a lot more, from a business perspective, a lot more agility and a lot less effort required to actually get started, because we don't have to think about what the process is exactly going to look like. What we can do once we've got it working is we can actually analyze the data and look at how many times did it follow a certain path. Now that is something that I'll touch on a bit later in the presentation when I show you some examples, but this we can now use to come up with what we think the next best action would be, for example. So the reason why, one of the key other benefits of knowledge style of this unstructured processes in a knowledge style work is, traditionally when you do knowledge style work, what we mean by knowledge style is I don't want to follow the workflow because I know it's not going to work. So that's how I always typify what a knowledge style worker will say when they look at a process. We now give them the option to route it any which way they want. The advantage is that we still have an audit trail in place, so we can still see that process as part of an audit trail. We can still see what decisions were made, even though we didn't force the route that they needed to go down. A critical element which is missing from most processes right now, if you have unstructured processes in your business that happen via email, it happens via Word documents, spreadsheets, and all sorts of things that go around, because structured workflow doesn't cater for the requirement, the flexibility. The problem is that you have no audit trails a part of that. Great examples are things like customer service, a case style where you've got an audit trail of a customer service request. The thing is, it can go to a number of people, be handled in a number of ways, and it's critically important that you have an audit trail of that knowledge style work that goes with it. If you've got ad hoc data entry in a complex environment, and I'll show you an example of that in the next screen, where you can't determine what data you're going to get next. Once again, it's a customer service environment, and there's just a lot of data that needs to go into the initial part of a process, and it can come from any time, any place, anywhere. The other example of where information can come from and what you need to do with it is, for example, social listening. And once again, if you look at our social listening webinar, you'll see this in action, where you can actually listen for tweets, for example, from Twitter. That's all around examples in your business, and now you can route the response to that, whether you retweet, whether it goes off to customer service, whether it goes off to marketing, whether it goes off to public relations, or and if we have to add more people, we can actually handle that on a case-by-case basis. So unstructured processes have a very strong case approach to them as well. So you almost handle it on a case-by-case basis. The rules change case by case, and social listening is one of those. Now, I mentioned the data entry example. This, for example, is a complex data entry environment where the process to capture the information from a funeral arrangement or arranger's point of view. Now, there's a lot of information that they need to get around funeral options. Obviously, they're selling inventory items to the family. They need to do specific arrangements around cars, viewing. There's a whole lot of things that need to be done with that. The challenge that you have is you don't get the information in a nice sequential sequence. It really comes to you over a 2 or 3 day period in a very erratic and ad hoc manner. You need to have the ability to capture that. At some point in time, you need to run a rule and say, do I have everything that I need to move this on in terms of the process, or is there still some information outstanding? So some of the fields are required in order for this process to actually move forward. But it gives, as you can see, there's a whole number of options here. Now these are all independent activities that we can choose at any point in time to actually route the work to. So the way that we can add those, so if we just add a new container, if we need a new step in here, we can add it in here with what we call our dynamic allocation logic, a very simple and easy way to add processes to XMPro dynamically. Example of the Twitter feed, I'm not going to go through the whole example again, but in this instance we were listening for Qantas when they had some issues, and there's certain things that you can do. It can be PR action, it can be bookings. Now the nice thing is, once again, we have a full audit trail of so we pick up the tweet and then we have a response to that. There can be multiple outcomes to that. So that is a typical unstructured process, because it still relies on a knowledge worker to read the message and decide what to do. There's no automatic routing or artificial intelligence built into this. Intelligent business operations are really there to support knowledge workers to actually get better at doing this. And that was the example of Twitter. So if we look at dynamic processes, as I said, unstructured processes and dynamic processes actually differ to some degree. Dynamic processes imply that they dynamically change based on certain events that occur, and I'll address some of those events in a minute or so. These dynamic processes are also context aware, so they know what goes on around them, and I'll show you I'll explain some examples of what context aware means. And then lastly, they've got built-in predictive analytics, and what that means is it'll actually show you information that will help you make better decisions, and sometimes based on that analytics it will actually dynamically change some of the routing options and steps that are available. So if we look at processes that change dynamically based on events, example of that is and I'm going to put all three of them just so that we have all of them. So when we say they can change on events, there are a couple of events that can impact these changes. One of them are data rule events, so we can check how close are we to our budget, and as soon as we get to within a certain percentage of our budget, so we've spent 80% of budget on a general ledger code, then we can introduce an additional approval step automatically. So it will dynamically change based on data rules. There's certain business rules that we may have as well. So if you've got a complex approval matrix, it can dynamically change who the routing will go to based on their seniority and maybe the general ledger code that we're using for the approval. So it doesn't mean that the workflow will always look the same. It can dynamically change based on a number of business rules. So we have data rules and business rules, and lastly we have social events or social rules that can also impact this. And so, for example, we can change the state when we get a Twitter thing like #carjacked help. We may escalate that immediately. We can do all sorts of things with specific events that we can listen for and dynamically change the routing and logic of a process, or even what's on the screen. When we talk about context aware, so the first one was they can they can dynamically change based on events. Secondly, these dynamic processes are context aware. What we mean by that is, what happens if the exchange rate changes? Well, if the exchange rate changes by more than 10%, we will want we need to introduce an additional approval step on all purchase orders from overseas, or we need to automatically introduce a activity that will always make sure that we buy a forward cover. Context aware. So, for example, if there was a storm, a massive storm in a certain area, geographical area, we may want to say we need to change, because we're going to have a huge influx of calls into the insurance call center. We actually want to take a 10-step process and turn it into 3, just to get the volumes through quicker. And you can change the approval rules based on something like that. So processes are a lot more context aware, for example. And then lastly, what happens, for example, also what happens if the oil price changes? It may have a certain impact. Now you can listen for those. There are web services, and as soon as I need to do a step, I can actually go and look at what the weather patterns are. And these are just examples of things. The context can also be who's doing the transaction. So, for example, if it's the CEO of an organization, there's one step in the approval. Or, yes, it always gets approved, or whatever the case might be. So it's also aware around who's doing the transaction, and based on that, it can change the routing, the logic, the rules, the approval limits, and everything that goes with it, or even what is displayed on the screen. So dynamic processes are a lot more context aware. And then lastly, they've got built-in predictive analytics. So you can have a graph in the approval form, and I'm going to show you an example of that. You can add additional steps to that approval based on a threshold. So for example, if I find that I'm within 80% of my budget, it can automatically add another step to that. It can also advise me on what we call what is the next best action. So the predictive analytics, because we don't have a predefined routing, we just have this container with 5 or 6 activities sitting in there. We may want to know, well, what did the guys before me do that? Or what is the happy path? What is the 80% rule around what the next step should be? For me, predictive analytics, the best way that it was described is that dashboards are rear view mirrors. You can see what happened in the past. With predictive analytics, we actually want to see what is coming and what is ahead of us. So the nice thing is they can give us in-flight analytics. So instead of having a dashboard where we look back, we can see where are we right now. So I'm sitting at it's like a GPS, the analogy that Janelle Hill at Gartner used was, it's like sitting with the GPS. I can see around me, I can see, and I can determine the context of where I am. So I've got in-flight analytics, and it gives me. And you can also do a real-time process discovery. So we can say, once again, where are we, or we can analyze when I'm in the activity. I can analyze all the previous instances of that activity, and I can say, well, what was the next best action that most people took out of that? So process discovery is just mining the existing process data, and we'll publish some documents and white papers around these concepts. So lastly, before I just quickly go into the software to show you, is that at Gartner they were also saying, where will BPM be in 2020? They will have unstructured processes. They will support dynamic BPM. There will be social BPM. It will support social BPM. They will be context aware. It will support organizational liquidity, which is just a fancy name for change management. But in the end, it's all around intelligent business operations. So let me give you an example of what you can get right now in 2011. You don't have to wait till 2020 to see some of this stuff in action. Let me just. So I'm just quickly going to log into XMPro. Oh, come on. Great. So I'm Tim Clark. I'm the second person. Someone else put in a requisition. I'm not going to take you through the whole workflow in terms of how you put in requisitions, but essentially someone started a new task to have a process. And in my to-do list under my cases, you will see that I have under procurement, under my task list, there's a purchase requisition from Keith that I need to approve. When I look at Keith, and this is a simplified example of typically what this can do, but as you can see, we've got a case file where we store all the documents as they come through as part of the process. These are the dynamic activities, so I can add more activities. Right now, I can either just approve it or decline it, or I can send it for technical approval. It might be that we're buying IT. I'm not sure why they're buying new bikes for Tour de France in IT, but that doesn't matter. So I might just send it for technical adjudication. And the great thing that you can see here is that we've actually embedded analytics or in-flight analytics. So I don't have to go off to my ERP. I can see what budget do I have available, how much has actually been spent, how much have we previously committed to this process, and how much has Keith previously requested. So you can build these graphs any which way that you want out of external data. So based on this, I can now make a decision on what I want to do. Looking at this, I'm still not sure what I want to do, so I can say, well, please advise me on the next best action. So I can see that of the last almost 200 processes that went through this activities, 145 of them were actually just approved from here. So this gives me an analysis of what everyone else before me did, and it gives me an indication if I didn't know what the next best action is. Now obviously this is a very simplified example of this. You can also take these dashboards and go and build right at the top here, and we'll publish some examples of that on our website, where you can build your process goal dashboard. So I can have 3 graphs up there showing me my process goals in terms of where are, what is my monthly budget, what are the actual expenditure and everything to date. Now this looks like it's quite complex to do. It really isn't. So this is the back end where we design processes. I'm not going to show you how to design processes. All I'm going to show you is how easy it is to set up a chart. So I can choose, in that instance, this is the one for the budget. So I'm just going to open that, and I can choose the layout, the look, feel, colors, and everything that I need for my chart, all in terms of properties and whatever it explains on the screen. So the budget goal, the wording, everything that you want to make it easy for people to understand how processes work. So in this instance, you can have your unstructured processes. It's got the built-in dynamic, and if you look at our social listening webinar, you will see that we've got extensive support for the social processes. So in terms of what intelligent business operations mean, right now XMPro can give you the unstructured processes that makes it quick to deploy. You don't have to, that's highly adaptive. The processes can adapt based on the rules. So if, for example, I am now at 80% of my budget, I can have another button appear here, or I can change that button to become executive approval. So I can dynamically change the process based on some of these rules here. That is a really powerful concept for something like expense control, where you would want, the closer you get to this budget line, that the rules change. And then lastly, we can also introduce discussions and the social aspect of BPM. Thank you for watching this. I really appreciate that. I'm trying to keep it as short as possible and show you as much as we can around the future and why we believe business process management moving to intelligent business operations can be achieved right now. Thank you very much.